the first question I have is actually from me. And I thought I'll take a little advantage of my position here. This is for all of the panelists. I want to know more about what you first believed or thought about what caused the damage at the Pentagon, and what evidence changed your mind. In other words, I want to know more of your personal story about your journey.
Say the two questions again.
I want to know more about what you first believed or thought. What was your first belief or thought about what damaged the Pentagon? And what evidence was it that changed your mind? In other words, and what was your personal story? And what happened to you emotionally as you went through your own journey?
So I'll start this off. My journey into 9/11 didn't start probably until I was in the anti-Iraq war movement. And I was being whispered in my ear about all this stuff, and I was given a DVD. I think the earliest one I got was In Plain Sight. And it just would go in one ear and out the other, or in one eye and out the other. But it left enough residue in there to say something was wrong with the Pentagon story, and the hole was too small. And ultimately, I became interested in the trade towers and architects and engineers. But I was a plane or a missile into the Pentagon kind of person, because it was a small hole, and it seemed like that's what everyone was talking about. So I joined the group think, I guess it is, and that's what I did. And ultimately, I've shifted to some other theories. I was at the 2013 presentation that Barbara Honegger made at the DC, and I said, oh, wow, this is really interesting. Someone's done a lot of research and looked at this stuff. And so I became a kind of an exploding plane kind of person too, but it wasn't quite right, wasn't quite sure. And then I was going to be putting on a presentation in 2014-15 about what hit the Pentagon. And I was going to have a series on the Twin Towers, Building 7, the Pentagon, anthrax, and a panel session with my local group. And the Pentagon one was going to be, well, there's 4 competing theories. And so I was putting it all together, and I was going to ridicule large plane impact. As I'm putting this together, I go through the slides, the different websites, this Googling everything and getting slides and pictures and all this other stuff. And I mentioned this in my talk, the thing that ultimately got me to stop was the 42-foot spacing between the retaining wall damage and the generator impact where the line would have gone through. And I said, this can't be faked. Who would have thought to do this? And how could they have done it? And I ultimately lost 3 nights of sleep because I was going to have to start eating my words, because I told Richard Gage in 2014, I refused to believe a large plane hit the Pentagon. He said, well, and experts speak out. We said never to say that, or be wary of people who say that. But I said it, and now look at me, because I've actually looked. And so it was the 42-foot spacing is what got me. Hope I didn't talk too long.
I joined the truth movement in 2007 after somebody handed me a DVD, and my first instinct was to debunk. I said, I'm a physicist. I will debunk this idea that the government lied to us about. But after 2 or 3 months' research into the towers and the building collapses, I sat down on my sofa and literally cried when I realized what they had done. Then I joined the 9/11 Truth Alliance, and there was a person there that I actually brought into the group who was a strong voice, and he said, let's not talk about the Pentagon. There's a terrible controversy going on. That's when I became aware of the Pentagon debate. And then after that, I was aware that people like Jim Hoffman and Victoria Ashley were being verbally maligned with disgusting ad hominem attacks, and that turned me off wanting to even look at it at all. So for several years, I didn't look at it. However, when David Ray Griffin invited me to be coordinator of scientists for 9/11 Truth, I then met Frank Legg and Stephen Jones, Kevin Ryan, and Niels Harrod. First thing that happened was we had a website that wanted an example of the Pentagon, and I put Frank's first paper up there, and I was told by other people on the board to take it down, and I said, no, this is a paper that has been vetted in the Journal of Environmental Studies. It doesn't say a large plane hit, but it says it could have. So I wouldn't take it down, and that made me a kind of a suspect person right then and there. But anyway, after that, we had discussions, and Frank Legg offered to explain to anybody who would listen about what he thought. And Victoria actually had previously offered to do that, but I hadn't listened to her. But when Frank offered it, I said, okay, I'll listen to you. So for 2 or 3 weeks, Frank and I dialogued. I looked into it, and after about 3 weeks, I sent an email to the board, and I said, the movement's gone down a rat hole on the Pentagon, and at some point it'll explode in our faces and blow away our credibility. After that, I started writing papers, and my first paper was in 2011. So I didn't have any prejudice against or for it until I looked into it. That's my story.
Yeah, I can't remember my thoughts too much about it prior to me reading about pilots for 9/11 Truth's claim about the plane being too high to hit the Pentagon. But basically after that, I was really intrigued because that, in my opinion, the FDR data would be solid evidence of something happening other than what we've been told. So I outlined in my presentation that's what basically started me looking into their claims and ultimately going through and decoding the flight data recorder. So at various points, I thought, as before I'd successfully decoded the data, at some points I thought that it was possible that the plane had flown over, and maybe the NTSB decode did not actually reflect the actual raw binary file at some points. But once I actually got my decoder to actually work, then I saw the final radio heights and saw yes, it definitely crashed in. So that was basically my journey.
Okay, my first exposure to the 9/11 Truth issue, where I started to educate myself, my sister went to a conference and brought some DVDs and stuff and said, you got to look into this. And one of the DVDs was Eric Huffschmidt's Painful Deceptions, and I thought it was a pretty flawed video, but there's a lot of good stuff in it. And I just I didn't quite know what to think about Pentagon. I didn't take it as a big deal, but he advocated the Global Hawk, small plane. And I was just taking it all in. I didn't have any real opinion about it. I didn't have a solid opinion. When I started, but that got me into investigating this. What really intrigued me was I started reading Jim Hoffman's website, and the thing I was really interested in was Jim Hoffman had an article in there about the dust on the, trying to look at the expansion of the dust cloud and trying to do some physics. And I thought, I can do that too. I mean, I'm not that, but I was figuring it sort of encouraged me to dig in and try and see what I could understand about it from my physics background. And I started getting into it, and one thing after another got me into deeper. But I didn't have anything modifying my Pentagon ideas. Later on, I saw that Jim Hoffman had he did a talk where he was advocating for large plane. I thought, interesting. But again, it was just sort of as a bystander. Where I really got off the fence was Frank Legg did a paper that was talking about how the north of Sitco flyover was an impossible maneuver. And he had a version of that he circulated around a mailing list. And I looked at that, and I saw that I could do the math better than he did. he had a calculation on how it could swerve to the left and swerve to the right, and how it would bank and all that. But it wasn't optimized, and I figured I had a way to approach that problem, and so I did that problem and contributed it back to him, and he invited me on as a co-author of the paper. And once he did that, I started getting my in-depth education about this. And I showed you one slide in my talk where I have all the radar positions in color-coded, and the FDR track. When I saw the alignment of everything, I mean, for me, that was it. It was a perfect alignment of radar, FDR, damage outside, damage inside, and everything about it. That alignment was what brought me, so I was fully convinced. And then everything else has gone from there. So I'll just stop there.
Well, I also first got introduced to the Pentagon issue with the video Painful Deceptions and the book Painful Questions. And because they were packaged with the first and new information about the World Trade Center, all three towers, I just sort of bought the whole package. And because the package included Global Hawk, I bought that too. And stayed there, as I mentioned earlier, for roughly a year, and was quite adamant that it had to be a missile. And then, after an argument with a fellow truther, where I kind of, on the way home, driving home, I sort of listened to my conversation with him and realized that I wasn't really listening to him. I was just trying to be right about what I believed. And I thought, no, this isn't good. I need to look at this again. And so I started looking at it again. There was some pretty good information online, and came away with what for me was kind of a odd conclusion that I wasn't sure. I just didn't really know which side of the argument was the right one. So I became agnostic, and I stayed that way for many years. But I kept asking questions of other people, but instead of arguing with them from what I thought was right, I would ask questions and listen to their answers with an open mind, which I didn't have before. And I asked questions that I thought would help me understand it. And one of the main questions I would ask is about the generator trailer, because this thing was so massive, it was so damaged, and it, tens of thousands of tons had been rotated, which would take a heck of a force. I thought, you have to be able to explain this. This is evidence. It's hard evidence, very hard evidence. A truck, right? And I noticed that everybody that took the no plane or missile or any stance other than large plane either didn't know about the generator trailer or didn't have anything to say about it that explained anything. And that happened person after person, year after year. And other similar questions, same thing. They just didn't have answers to some of the most important evidence. And that started me thinking, I guess it had to be a plane, because if nobody, that thinks it wasn't, doesn't have any answers, and the large plane totally explains it, so I started drifting more and more in the direction of a big plane. But for reasons that others have given, like the incredible ridicule that Jim Hoffman and Victoria Ashley and other people that were suggesting it was a large plane, the hostility they were experiencing, I thought, I don't need that. So I kind of avoided it. Also at the time, I was producing a series of videos, DVDs for David Ray Griffin, and he had no plane stance, although it's shifted over the years, and it's continuing to shift. And it would have been awkward for me to produce DVDs that had something in it that I'd need to argue with him. The only thing I ever questioned him about on the Pentagon was very early on, and he had back then he was doing the small hole. And by that time I had looked at Jim Hoffman's website, which was very compelling, especially on the size of the hole. It was like, what's so obvious? This is a huge hole, not a teeny hole. That I I contacted David as editing his video. I said, David, this isn't true. We should leave this out. Look at this evidence. Sent him to Jim Hoffman's website, and David got back to me. He said, yep, you can pull that out. And but that was, we kind of left it there. And so then towards the end of around 2009, I was in Australia videotaping and speaking over there, and Frank Lake spoke on the Pentagon. And I had great respect for Frank. I got to meet him both times I was in Australia, and I knew he was very wise and very smart and knew his physics and science. And so I thought, okay, this is looking gooder. It's getting better for the plane. But still, I was not fully convinced until I started looking at some of the papers written by John Wyndham and David Chandler and Frank Legg and others, John Cole. And you read those papers, if you really take the time to read all those papers, you know what happened. I mean, these people are good. They know what they're talking about. They know their science. And so it was at that point, I was essentially convinced, but I still had a few questions. And I wasn't going to do anything about it, really, other than, if asked, say what I thought. And then there became more of a challenge where I had to take a stance, and I did, by answering the last of the questions. And the last question for me was, what made the white smoke? And when I discovered that tree that was clipped, I knew. Well, of course, you suck leaves and branches into a super hot jet engine. They're going to make first water vapor, which is visible for a while, and then they're going to make smoke. And that trail of smoke has an undulation to it, looks just like a spiral, just like you'd get out of a jet engine, which is rotating. So you have rotating smoke coming out of the right engine. There's the white smoke. And that was like, okay, now what? And about that time, I started working on the Pentagon plane puzzle, which is still a work in progress. And so I had to answer all my questions, and I enlisted the help as consultants of all the people that had written all the papers. I said, these papers need to be a video, because most people don't read, especially that kind of a technical paper. But they watch videos, and it's the videos that got us all off track, so it's going to take videos to get us back on track. And so I started working on the Pentagon plane puzzle and consulting, getting total consensus on every point that I put in. If I had one image in there, anything that wasn't quite right, I had to answer to them, because I wanted their endorsements and because I knew they were thinking about it, not from a bias, not from an opinion they'd gotten, but from solid evidence and solid research. So my change was gradual, so I didn't have any big aha moment. I did later, but that's another story on another topic, because what I've learned is these biases that I'm trying to get people to understand, as I try to understand them more, will really help us answer any and all questions that are still in controversy in the movement. And I feel very strongly that if our movement is ever going to get real traction, whether it's in the court of law or even in the minds of the people, we got to be able to agree a little more on a few things. I mean, if we're saying things that are easily disprovable, or if we're saying things that we don't agree even with amongst ourselves about, why are we going to expect people from outside that we're trying to convince that we're really solid in what we're doing? So that's what motivates me to do this. I want to help correct a mistake that I helped make. So I feel some responsibility, and I'm a truth seeker. Thank you.
So this next question, Ken, is probably for you, and it follows on what you just said, I believe. This is from a friend who could not make it, but he really wanted me to ask this question. He says, what concerns me about this conference is that more energy is being spent on supporting the official story than deconstructing it. How is this helpful? Can you expand on that a bit?
Fran got this question a few months ago, and we figured we need to address it. So we've been talking about it for a few months, how best to answer it. And so I do have a prepared question I'm going to answer that I'm going to read, because we worked together on the answer to try to make it as clear and as effective as we could. So our answer. A few people in the 9/11 truth movement accuse us of supporting the official 9/11 narrative about the Pentagon attack. As we see it, acknowledging a large plane hit the Pentagon does not support the official story any more than acknowledging that 2 planes hit the World Trade Center support the official story. It helps our movement to seek, find, and disseminate the truth of 9/11. To be genuine truth seekers, we must look for the truth wherever it lies and let the chips fall where they may. The goal of truth seeking and of science is to carefully look at all the relevant evidence and determine which hypothesis best fits the evidence. And this is precisely our goal. AE 9/11 Truth has done an excellent job carefully looking at the evidence for the destruction of the 3 World Trade Center towers, and this, by far, is where our best evidence lies. However, the scientists for 9/11 Truth, which we all are a part, are free to look at all aspects of 9/11, not only the 3 buildings. As truth seekers, we must look at all of the evidence about the Pentagon and come to our conclusions accordingly. That is what's necessary if we're to be credible to the public and in a court of law. Imagine if we get traction in a court of law around the World Trade Center collapses, and the government's lawyers bring up the Pentagon issues, claiming that the people presenting the case are the same people who believe no plane impacted the Pentagon. And then they clearly show that Flight 77 actually impacted the Pentagon. That would discredit us. Imagine how counterproductive it would be for our movement and how it would impact the court's view of our credibility. So we must present this evidence ourselves. We must not leave it to our opponents or to the opposition. The evidence we have presented here today needs to be in our movement's conversations, because disseminating theories that are seductive to some but can be readily shown to be false has already weakened our credibility and will continue to do so until we deal with it. The information you have heard today is not the end of the conversation. Science never stands still, and sometimes challenges to our preconceived notions, and sometimes challenges our preconceived notions and our biases. Most of the speakers here today once believed no plane impacted the Pentagon. But as more evidence has come to light, we have changed our minds, as truth seekers often must do.
All right, thank you. The next question is from Elizabeth Woodworth, and this is, I'm sure, a very common question. It's on everyone's mind. Why were the FBI confiscating video evidence within minutes? Traffic jams all around the Pentagon, she notes. And another related question is, if indeed 77 hit the Pentagon, why the apparent suppression of video evidence that would bolster the key piece of the official government story? So what about that?
I've actually written an article on some of this, but I'll try to be short so everyone else can speak as well. The FBI collected all the evidence because that's their job. That's what they do. Whether it's something real, whether it's a false flag, it doesn't matter. Their job is to collect evidence. That's why they collected evidence. It's no more complicated than that. And what was the second question about?
Yeah.
Yes.
They were there within minutes. They were expecting.
Right, that's their job.
But how did they know it was going to happen?
That's a good question. Thank you for that part of the question. I don't know how they got there quite so fast, other than it happened in D.C. and they're headquartered there.
But there were traffic jams all around. Like the whole place.
Another good question. Do you know how fast they got there?
2 or 3 minutes. Like right
That's fast. That's a good question. See, we don't have all the answers yet.
Well, I think the fact that they got there in a few minutes seemed a little suspicious.
I don't know the facts behind what you just claimed there, but if they were there anomalously fast, very well could be they knew what was going to happen, or somebody knew what was going to happen, and that sort of goes along with our understanding of the event as a whole. So to say that somebody knew what was going to happen, that's not an anomaly. That's sort of part of what we're about. But I don't. I'd like to know the background. I'd like to know the data behind that claim. So I haven't heard that before.
So, a related question is from Dorothy Lorig. What photographic evidence do we have, if any, of the interior of the plane? In other words, the bodies, the seats, the luggage, cockpit instruments, etc. If there's no photographic evidence available to the public, why do you think this is? Why would the government have withheld these photos? And let me see if there's something related here that I've missed. What about the chain of custody of the DNA? And was there any Arab DNA? Anyone? So the main thing is, why do you think it is that there was do we have photographic evidence of the interior of the plane, body, seats, luggage, cockpit instruments, etc.? If there is none, why do you think that is?
So I'm going to address only a portion of this. First of all, the plane entered the building, and there was a huge fire in there. And so many of the parts of the plane are aluminum. Aluminum, if anyone has studied forensic fire detection, fire forensics, you'll know that aluminum will melt at 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit. And so it's typically, if you want to know where a fire was, you can look at aluminum parts, and if they're up high, they will be melted. If they're like the threshold where air will come into a building, an aluminum threshold, they might survive a fire. But much of the aluminum in the central area where the fires were the hottest may not have survived as an intact, unmelted aluminum. I mean, and then when you get to the further away places where the wings were, it may have survived. There are some reports, some audio recordings at Voices of 9/11, Staff Sergeant Brahman. It's a 45-minute video or audio, and he goes through it, and he actually talks about going inside and climbing over wings to get body parts and things like that apparently in some of the extremities. They also talk, if you listen to these videos or these audio records that are on Voices of 9/11, you'll hear that there are people alongside FBI people who are photographing everything. The Lawyers Committee for 9/11 has been trying, and independent people before them have been trying to get these records from the government, and they have not been forthcoming at all. We don't know why they haven't. There's some that have been selectively released as part of the Moussaoui trial evidence. That's some of the places where we see some of the more gruesome pictures of the inside. But there must be many, many more. So to address why don't we see it, it's because they won't release it. Why won't they release it? I don't know. And so many of the parts that were inside just probably have been largely obliterated. There are people that do talk about seeing bodies strapped to seats, but I've never seen pictures of the seats. But the government isn't forthcoming on the stuff, and that's why we need to support the Lawyers Committee's FOIA requests and other independent people trying to get this data. I don't know if there's anything else anyone wants to add.
Something to that. Why would a government that has just committed a horrendous crime, which I believe it did, 9/11 was a horrendous crime, and the evidence all shows that it was perpetrated from the inside, why would anybody connected with it release more information that might inadvertently reveal something that they don't want us to know? And it's totally to their advantage to have us all arguing and debating about things and divided amongst ourselves. I see no absolute reason why anybody who perpetrated such a crime would want to give us anything. And that's why we don't get anything, simply because it was a horrendous crime, and we have to be kept in confusion and disarray and debate and fighting each other and in ignorance. That's the strategy.
And there is a database of body parts. I have it, but I'm not sure exactly where. I have to trace down where I can refer you to it. But it's a map showing where each sample was connected, and it's all numbered, and it's color-coded for who was passengers and who was, what? It was part of the Moussaoui trial, right? It's part of the evidence. But there's actually an EXE file, so you can run it on a Windows machine, and you can actually go and click on each individual body part, and it'll tell you who it was and which other parts were of the same person and stuff like that. So it's pretty detailed, and I believe there's a similar map for the World Trade Center. So, some people might question credibility of this or that, but I think there was a major effort to document human remains. And so I think it's a credible database, but you can take it for what it's worth.
Regarding pictures, I have seen some pictures. They're kind of gruesome of dead bodies that were found in the Pentagon. In fact, where I found them, they actually had a warning before you got to the pictures. It wasn't clear to me looking at those pictures whether they were Pentagon employees or plane occupants, but nonetheless, they exist. And probably the biggest thing has already been covered. The things that happened, the plane hitting the Pentagon was a very high energy event, which shattered everything. It shattered the plane, it shattered what was in the plane, it shattered the building. Things were pretty crunched up. Larger pieces, heavier pieces, stronger pieces of the plane survived, but passengers and stuff inside are not so strong and heavy. So not a lot of it survived in a way that was photographable. It was, in fact, they had to get trained dogs to go in to find the human remains because they had to be found by smell. So it's kind of a gruesome thing, but there are written descriptions of people saying they saw people still strapped to their seats in the plane. I have not seen those pictures. So there's a lot of questions, and the meta problem behind all this, I think we know, is that our government is not only incredibly corrupt, it is incredibly secretive. They go together. And so we have to file FOIA reports to get evidence to investigate these things. And people have done that. And unfortunately, within our movement, we are not always aware what other people in the movement are doing. I have found lots of evidence that came from FOIA requests that people in our movement have issued and gotten evidence from. And then, as has been mentioned earlier, there was the Moussaoui trial. Moussaoui trial was a gold mine of evidence. And yet few people in our movement have even looked at all that evidence. So some of it is just do more research. Some of it is file FOIA requests because that's the only thing we have to get around this extreme government secrecy that allows the level of corruption that we're dealing with.
I want to add one thing. In that database where it plotted out a map of where all the body parts were, one thing I was surprised at when I saw it, there was a huge concentration of the body parts that were identified in what spilled out onto the AE drive. So you all saw that, and it doesn't look like bodies there. But there was dozens, if not hundreds, of samples of various, something that at least DNA testable, that was in that pile that you saw with your own eyes. So that's the level of fragmentation we're talking about.
I'll just add, related to this, because I want to be sure we cover that point pretty carefully. Am I being heard? As someone has asked, is there, on the DNA evidence, is there a chain of custody and independence of the laboratories tasked with these examining with the DNA evidence? So there's a question about was there a chain of custody? And another question just regarding the photos inside the Pentagon. Were these released with a FOIA release? And how were they, the pictures you have shown on the slides of interior damage inside the Pentagon, was it a FOIA release, or how did you get those pictures? So,
first of all, there are many photos that are just floating around on the internet, you know, and when I've used things like that, I've kind of gravitated towards looking for multiple versions of the same thing. But the gold mine that I have is, if you go to Wikimedia, you'll see September 11th, and what you can, Pentagon on September 11th, September 12th, September 13th, 14th. I don't think there's anything on the 15th, 16th, 17th, up through the 20th. Pictures that were taken, many of the pictures that you've seen about the Pentagon, you'll find there'll be references to who did them. Many times, many of the Jason Ingersoll photos are up there. So it's a gold mine for high quality photos. When people would ask me, where do you get this stuff? That's where I tell them, that's where I get it. The day after, Jocelyn Agostino from FEMA recorded many photos from the inside. The one that we saw with the bent and curved columns that I kind of talked about was one of those that she had done. And that's another good source of video, a good source of photographs, high quality. It's really hard to see what you're looking at because sometimes they were taken in the early days before there were column numbers for the rescue people. So you're just looking at columns and you have no idea where they are. But later on, there's numbers, and you can sometimes you can see what they actually say, what the numbers are, and you can kind of place where they are. There are other photos, and they usually have the attributions on them. So Wikimedia, not Wikipedia, Wikimedia, September 11th, Pentagon, is where you'll find a lot of this stuff. Also, if you want some really interesting videos, I can't quite tell you how to get there, but if you go onto the FBI, if you Google the FBI website, the Pentagon, the Vault, you'll end up with links to, I think, 8 videos. They're actually posted on YouTube, but they're unlisted. And the only way you get to them is going through this, the Pentagon Vault. And once you get them, then you can download them. And then I've got a number of them. I've got the links. But that's another good source. And what they did is what many of these are of the day, of the cleanup, of the few days later, of it weeks later, some weeks later, and they kind of walk through the damage. And if you want to see a good picture of the uplifted slab from many different angles, zoomed in, and all that stuff, it looks clearly like it was mechanical damage and not an explosion, but because it breaks it along the lines. But those videos are good. And chain of custody, I'm not exactly sure. I think there might be something in those about where they were taken from, or other people would know what they are. But that you have to triangulate, because you don't always know the authenticity, and they don't always show you everything in the right perspective that you want to see it. I've talked too much already, I think.
I'm actually going to continue on this same theme, because I just had an email conversation with some folks in San Diego, and I am so grateful that they sent their questions in, because that's what we want. We want people to ask their questions, and we want this whole issue to be discussed at the level of evidence. So there's a couple of pilots in San Diego, and this one is from Ted Muga, Colonel Ted Muga, U.S. Navy, retired. And he said, at the crash site, where is the evidence of a 757's indestructible parts? The 2 titanium engines and the landing gear assembly are nowhere to be seen. The interior cabin contents are for the most part, are fireproof. Where are the seats, luggage, and body parts of the passengers? So just put that in there because I want to get it in the record that I did ask it. I know part of it's been answered, but I'll continue. Let you all add what you need to add about that.
There are quite a few answers in Pentagon Plane Puzzle, even though it's just a draft.
So the thing that we saw in many of the videos today were pictures of the landing gears and the wheel rim, for example, that was in the AE drive. There was also pulled out of the building. There were the entire landing gears or the landing wheel structure with the dual wheels. There's at least 2 of those groupings that I've seen. There's dragged out of the front of the building. One of them has the rotor, the compressor rotor for the engine. That's one of the titanium pieces. But everything seems to have been jumbled up into a lot of smaller pieces, and they're really hard to identify. The aluminum pieces, while the interior may be fire resistant, it's not something that won't melt. If it's aluminum and it's it's exposed to temperatures of 1,100 degrees, it's likely to be turned into absorbed by all the other stuff into a hard slushy thing when it's cooled off. So I think there's a lot of material that was presented today that addresses the large pieces. And again, the government has not been very forthcoming. The Lawyers Committee has asked for documentation of all the parts that were cataloged because supposedly they were all photographed and cataloged, and they just won't be released. And I agree with the statements that John made about just how if you want it to be, you don't want any real investigation. Matter of fact, it took the 9/11 families a long time to get a commission report that was, by many standards, a whitewash, according to the chairman. Over.
I just wanted to make one comment, which is you often hear about the indestructible engines and things like that. What you see in the rubble are parts of these, like the rotor, and like it was saying, oh, this is too small for a 757. But in fact, it is a part that's in the structure of the engine, and it's actually can be identified with a 757. So the lot of things that get said repeatedly, and everybody takes for granted that you can't tear apart an engine. And under the kind of energy involved in a 500-mile-an-hour collision is phenomenal. And that can break apart all kinds of stuff. And yeah, the engines broke apart, and we were seeing pieces of them.
I just want to speak briefly to that energy because Frank Legg did a calculation to try to bring it down to earth, so to speak, so we can understand what kind of energy we're talking about when a plane hits an object at 561 miles an hour. He did a calculation actually using a lower speed, 530, I believe, and came up with an equivalency of if you take a tractor-trailer truck that's 10 tons and it's going 60 miles an hour, that's something we're familiar with. It happens on the freeway all the time. It has a kinetic energy. In order to be the same kinetic energy as that plane at 100 tons hitting at 561 miles an hour, would take 700 tractor-trailer trucks going 60 miles an hour, all concentrated into the space of an airliner. That's a lot of energy.
How could a body part survive that slam and that collision? How could any body parts? How could? Yeah, they were.
They're fragmented.
Their chairs still looking human.
Yeah. If you look at the diagram that was shown several times today of the body parts and count them, and then count up how many people were involved, those bodies were shattered, but they're still, you only need a cell to identify DNA.
But they weren't recognizable as a human.
That's why they used dogs, so that they could find them.
First of all, there's a huge amount of energy, but it's not all concentrated, and there are some parts that probably were sheltered. It's not like you're hitting, it's not like that Sandia jet that hits a concrete wall in which everything is exposed to being exposed. If for example, one side or one part had gone through and missed all the columns and it didn't hit anything, and it could decelerate as a unit. It's not impossible. It'd be broken up, and but if you go back and listen to Staff Sergeant Christopher Brahman's Voices of 9/11, you'll hear him talking about the picking up pieces, fingers with rings on it, wedding rings, other body parts, and putting them in bags, and how they were all treated so I guess the word he used was respectfully. But there were many fragments of body parts that were picked up. But that doesn't mean that everything got crunched up at the same way in the same place, because there was a lot of parts of the plane. So that's all I wanted to add.
Okay, the next question is also from San Diego, and I believe this is from David Gapp, whom I believe is also a pilot. And and I know this question has lingered in our minds, most of us, for a long time. So I want to ask it: how could a 757 fly that low, that fast, for that long, by an untrained pilot, all the time fighting ground effect on the control surfaces? Remember that the 9/11 Commission report states that Hani Hanjour was the alleged pilot. Number 2, I'm just going to read all 3. Has this been replicated by a 757 simulator by untrained, marginally trained pilots? Number 3, how could an untrained pilot do a controlled airspeed 270-degree spiral from 7,000 feet and end up just short of the Pentagon? What are the chances? Why didn't said pilot just head straight for the Pentagon from altitude? Can you remember all that?
Probably do this one.
Okay, let's do them one at a time. How could a 757 fly that low, that fast, for that long by an untrained pilot all the time, fighting ground effect on the control surfaces? Remember that the 9/11 Commission report states that Hani Hanjour was the alleged pilot. And then I'll just put number 2. Has this been replicated on a 757 simulator by untrained, marginally trained pilots?
I'd like Warren to answer part of the question. I think that you were, all right, Warren and Frank Legg discussed a lot of this. So I thought that maybe out of our conversation on that, or do you want to answer that, or the business about the flight? Well, okay. Frank Legg actually, despite the, all right, I have basically a tendency to believe it was not being flown by a human being in the last part of the flight. There's evidence from more than one, like Flight 175 at the World Trade Center. There has been a good analysis by somebody I think did a very good job of showing that that was a computer-controlled final approach. So I'm not saying the whole flight was computer controlled like this, but the final approach, I think it was taken out of the hands of the pilot and was guided in, possibly even with beacons from the target end. I'm not sure about that, but I've heard some discussion of that. But on the other hand, Frank Legg was actually, who was himself a pilot, I believe, at some level, but he actually was looking for how, is it a fact or is it a myth that you could not do that final big maneuver by hand? And presumably, he believes that it actually was flyable with fairly minimal, I mean, for a practice, if you practice it, you could actually do that kind of a maneuver. I don't personally think that, I think the last whole part of it was done by computer control, which gets around a lot of the question, is that it doesn't have to be an amateur event at the end. That's another thing. This flight, the last flight of the 77, all those flights were very, you saw where there was the 10 flights in a row on the FDR. The last flight was very different because every time they took off the autopilot, it was very irregular in its flying. And in fact, there's another graph that doesn't just show altitude, but it's showing a whole bunch of parameters, and everything is going wild when there was this, appeared to be an amateur human-controlled pilot at the stick several times during the flight. And so that indicates there was an amateur pilot aboard. It doesn't prove it, but I mean, it's evidence in that direction. But that's interestingly in contrast to the precision guidance at the very end. So I think that there might be on one level an amateur pilot sort of getting it to Washington, D.C., and then it got taken over. So that's my working hypothesis. It's not like I'm not going to stand behind that and try to prove it, but that's where I come out on that. So others might have. We're not unified in. There are a number of these opinions that we don't all share the same opinion, but that's where I come out on that.
I just want to second that. We definitely don't have answers to the questions of how the piloting was done. We do have evidence, and David just mentioned what I consider some of the best, which is those 2 periods towards the end of the flight of 77 where the autopilot was turned off, because flying was quite smooth up to before and after that. And so that's evidence of something, and I put that to you. Do your own research. Tell us what you think happened during those 2 periods. And definitely, I would agree with David. The final approach would require some pretty high skill, and there's many possibilities for remote control or guidance of some sort beyond what the pilots might have been capable of. I do know this, however, most of the flight was very easy, and there's been a lot of things said about the long spiral descent. And if you go on YouTube and you Google Flight 77 flying, there are people in simulators duplicating that descent. And the ones I've seen, the ones I've watched, it looks pretty easy. And the guy isn't working hard at all. He's talking you through it, telling what he's doing the whole time. So other than that final approach where the plane for the last 36 seconds was accelerating from about 300 miles an hour to 561, the flight wasn't all that hard, and that's been proven by, again, amateur pilots in flight simulators. Repeatedly, multiple pilots have done that the rest of the flight. The rest, the final approach, we don't know. And we don't really know exactly who was flying it. We don't have data, that we can analyze other than the recent discovery of this erratic flying, the 2 periods when when the autopilot was turned off.
And we're not out to support the official story, by the way.
So I want to just touch on a couple of things. First of all, why didn't they just dive in and go hit the Pentagon? First of all, there's a lot of people that suspect that there was a specific part of the building they wanted to hit, as opposed to just hitting the Pentagon. It's unclear. So if they had stayed high before they did the spiral descent, they would have thought that it was trying to go someplace else. But by doing the sudden spiral, it didn't take very long for that to happen, and it may have been just diversionary. If there was a strategy, it could be that there's some other reason for it, because we don't know what they actually were doing. The 270-degree spiral descent only produced G-forces of about 1.6 Gs. It's significant, but not too bad. Daniel O'Brien thought it was a fighter because commercial planes don't do it, not because they can't, because that's just not what they do. One of the people who's done the approach in a simulator was John Bursell of Australia, and he had had to try 5 or 6 times to actually hit the Pentagon in the simulator. And he ultimately had to do it with a nose down of 1.2 degrees, which is actually what corresponds to the FDR angle, which leads to think that it had to be a very highly vetted approach, not something an amateur would do. And the reason is that as a plane accelerates, it's not ground effect, because it's actually not even near the ground until the last 1,000 feet, and you can't pop up. But as a plane is accelerating, what happens is the wings, just the additional speed makes the plane rise, and so missing and going over would be a function of not ground effect, but just the ever-increasing speed. And for an untrained pilot to push it, go nose down and set everything right, makes it really unlikely that an untrained pilot could have done this. And I also want to say that a human if you're going to put explosives in the Twin Towers to break it down in Building 7, are you going to trust a human being to without supervisory control of really confidence, real high confidence that you're going to let someone fly a plane in. You've got too many things going on. It has to be something that would have been highly automated, and how it was done, I don't know. But it is, I sure wish we would spend time trying to answer those questions than is the scratch on the highway where someone moved Lloyd's pole. It just doesn't make, that's where we should be focusing on the flight stuff and not a lot of the other stuff for which is irrelevant.
Okay, just to acknowledge that, go ahead.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, Warren, too, on this same subject. Shall I just, you want to go ahead, or?
Okay.
Okay.
Shall I just finish?
Yes,
Yeah,
go
just
ahead.
answer it. Okay. We could see in the FDR data things like when the autopilot was turned off and on, there's like clear parameters for that, but there's no like clear parameter, like off-on parameter that I know of for like remote control or switching to some pre-programmed system other than things like the autopilot being turned off and on. So I can't see anything. I can't see anything definitive that would support that. Of course, whether something was secretly installed or whatever, who knows? But yeah.
Okay, you answered the question.
I answered that.
Yeah, that was the question I was going to ask you. You answered it.
Yeah, but people have asked me whether I can see anything that absolutely clear cut says that the plane was under remote control, and unfortunately I can't. There's no parameter that I've found that actually is like a remote control on off type parameter that would like definitively say that the plane, that you could point to and say, well, we know whether the remote control was off or on, unfortunately.
Okay, so there are other questions in that direction, and one was from Michael Hoy, which you don't need to answer because I think you've answered it, but just suggesting the possibility of a beacon planted at the Pentagon, and I think you've already covered that. I want to go to Barbara Honegger, and she's got several questions here, but one is a comment, and I'm guessing that she would really want this to be stated. So this is for John Wyndham. In your analysis, and I just want to state this for the record, in your analysis of other hypotheses, except a large plane or 757 impact, and in your quote-unquote rebuttal of my research findings, you completely mistake my hypothesis and findings, claiming it is only pre-placed explosives. It is not. It is combined plane destruction at the heliport plus pre-placed explosives. Please correct this.
Well, I think, Barbara, you're picking at straws here, because if the white plane that you postulate exploded outside the wall, it didn't do any damage that we know of. There is no damage that we can attribute to a white plane exploding. So when I listed those theories, I was listing theories of people, and I was saying what caused the damage. And as far as I understand your theory, the only thing that could have caused the damage would be bombs and explosives.
Incorrect.
I want to add to this, by the way, when you're done.
Well, I don't understand. This is not a debate, so I'm answering your question. As far as I can see, if your white plane exploded outside the wall and didn't do any damage, that leaves only bombs and explosives that would do damage. So I believe I correctly stated your theory. Your theory is that the damage was entirely due to bombs and explosives. That's not your entire theory, but it is the part of your theory that you have for the damage.
That's incorrect. You leave out the explosives outside the building, in my theory.
Well, that's, again, explosives. it's whether they're inside the building or outside the building, your theory is that explosives did all the damage. It doesn't matter where they are.
Incorrect. It accounts for the wreckage, exactly where we find it at the Unicorn, and the explosives pre-placed, just like at the World Trade Center, inside and outside the building, including the diesel trailer.
No, the white plane is your explanation for how the debris was north of the impact hole, whereas the correct explanation for why the debris was there is the momentum and the trailing air mass, etc., which we have gone into detail. So there are no, there is nothing that I can find in your work that ascribes the damage to anything else but explosives. Nothing at all.
But look at my rebuttal video.
Well,
I think that's good, everyone to look at Barbara's rebuttal. And can I move on, or did you have something you must add?
Well,
David?
okay.
We want to kind of move on, so let me, if it's important, go for it.
Okay, the only thing I was going to add, one of the, right, a big problem with the whole concept of a second plane exploding over the lawn or whatever, that did not continue forward and damage the wall of the Pentagon. There's a standard physics question that, I mean, I teach physics all the time, and one of the questions that's pretty much always there, if you take a hand grenade and you throw it, there's a trajectory. If the hand grenade explodes, and then you calculate the momentum of all the pieces, the center of mass of the exploded hand grenade continues on exactly the same trajectory. So in other words, it doesn't matter if you have one piece or not. The interactions within that hand grenade does not stop the momentum of the hand grenade. So in other words, if you take an airplane that's moving at any kind of air flying speed toward the Pentagon, and then you blow it up with a missile or whatever method you want, the center of mass of all of those chunks of the plane, some of them will be accelerated faster than before, others less, but the center of mass of the continued pile of fragments continues at the same speed that it was going, or the same momentum total. And it is inevitably going to crash into the wall. And if the litter that was on the north, early on it was like the litter that was on the north part of the lawn was considered to be too small to be a plane that exploded. And then all of a sudden, here's this theory that it's an entire plane, and all of the questions about where is the debris, from the American Airlines plane apply to this plane. And so where are the wheels? Where are the landing struts? Where are the engines? Where's anything from this plane other than small scattered debris? And also with that is the security cameras from the driveway didn't show anything on the lawn up until the actual plane hitting and creating the explosion. So I don't know, the danger of even putting that answer out there is I don't think we're wanting to get in beyond that. I want to say the part of our critique of this theory is that the white plane is physically, I would say, physically impossible. It's not a plausible physical explanation of really anything. And it's definitely not an explanation of what happened to the visible damage in the Pentagon.
And my critique video shows that your path is impossible physically.
Okay, so that's an invitation to everyone to listen to Barbara Honegger's rebuttal. And Robin Horden, just to acknowledge, asked a couple of questions about the white plane, but I think those have been pretty much covered. So I'm going to go on to another question from Robin. And this is for Ken Jenkins regarding the no plane meme. So Dr. Morgan Reynolds, holding a PhD in economics and serving a Republican president, surfaced with high visibility. Regarding the two strikes at World Trade Center 1 and 2, his most notable contribution claimed that airliners were beer cans, quote unquote. Could this inaccurate statement have contributed to the no-plane theory in general?
The beer can theory? Is that what we're talking about? Or?
Yeah. His most notable contribution claimed that airliners were beer cans, and in other words, I think
right.
what he's saying
A
could
hollow-
not have made those impacts could not have impacted the steel columns.
Okay.
And so this was obviously an inaccurate statement. Could this have contributed to the no-plane theory? No plane at the World Trade Center, thus no plane at the Pentagon, I think is what Robin is saying. Am I getting that pretty correct, Robin?
Well, I think
Okay.
the answer to the question is sort of been given, but I'll just briefly sum it up again. The plane was traveling, according to our calculations, according to the FTR, at 561 miles an hour on impact, and it's about 100 tons. If you do the math, it's an incredible amount of energy, and that energy has the force that can do incredible amount of damage. And it's one metaphor I use to try to get people to understand why it makes such a difference how fast things are going. The energy goes up as the square of velocity, and if that doesn't make sense, try this. If you take a normal bullet from a gun, just the end of the bullet, the lead, and you just take it in your hand and you toss it at a wall, it might make a little dent at most. You take that exact same bullet and fire it out of a gun at hundreds and hundreds of miles an hour, it could go through the wall, it's going to do serious damage. Same bullet, the only difference is the speed. And it's the same with these planes. The planes were going unusually fast compared to almost any plane crash in history. And because of the huge difference in energy, like say if it was going a normal landing speed of 200, when pilots are flying a plane that might crash, they do everything they can to save lives, save damage, and so they fly, amongst other things, as slow as they can and still fly safely so that if and when they crash, there's a minimum of damage and a chance of survival. Just the opposite happened on 9/11. The pilots accelerated just before the crash and got up to, again, a speed quite a bit higher. And so if it's 50 miles an hour versus 500, that's 10 times faster. It's 100 times the energy. And those numbers matter. We're talking orders of magnitude. And so it's the energy is the key, and if you take a beer can and you fire it fast enough, it will also penetrate. It's not a question of it being lightweight. Oh, it's just aluminum. It doesn't matter. You make a bullet out of aluminum, you don't want to be in front of it when it's fired.
There are YouTube videos of ping pong balls being shot through 3/4-inch plywood. I think that's a good, just look it up. It's wonderful to see, It's fun. Anyway, you just look up ping pong ball. Supersonic. They send them up to the speed of sound or so. Yeah, supersonic actually. They basically have a long vacuum tube and they accelerate it down that, and you can literally penetrate 3/4-inch plywood, and here's a round hole from a ping pong ball. Incredible.
I believe it's water cutters that actually cut metal, just basically with high-speed water. So that's another example.
Yep.
So I want to build on what David Chandler just said. You can watch the YouTubes of the ping pong balls going through paddles, plywood, whatever. What it is, it's a certain amount of mass, so many grams of something going at a speed. And the only difference between it being a beer can or a slug is when it hits something is the energy of compression of the metal, and that's usually a pretty small part. Mostly it's what's the mass and what's it impacting. If it's going slow, yes, there's going to be some slowing down because it's a low amount of kinetic energy to dissipate in the crushing. But it's very fast. The energy going to crush stuff is very small, and so a plane hitting the Pentagon is going to get compressed and get squished, and parts of it some energy is going to go into the deformation of the plane, but most of it's going to be going into hitting against the facade, the columns, the people, the whatever's inside. Same effect if you looked at the Twin Towers. I just put together an article on the 9/11 TAP website about where the steel columns, perimeter columns on the trade towers were broken, and they were broken almost exclusively at the bolts. The bolts were the weak points. They were designed to hold things together, not these huge lateral impacts and the welds, some of the welds. But that's an impact of, a huge amount of energy being impacted, a lot of probably deformation of the aluminum, et cetera. Over.
Okay, this next question is for Warren regarding Flight 77. This is from Charles Coleman. Is there evidence on the FDR of aerodynamic flutter in the seconds prior to impacting the Pentagon?
Yes, I think we did in my paper with Frank Legg. I think there's a bit in the vertical accelerations. There was something that Frank thought could be evidence of flutter.
Other words,
Yeah.
When you speed up, it hands like that? Yes.
Yes. Yeah. From looking at the vertical acceleration data.
the significance of that being instability when you're flying too fast compared to the design of the plane. All of a sudden it starts behaving badly. And so was the wing fluttering in the process? And what he's saying is that there is some evidence that that was.
It wasn't meant to go 500 miles?
No, that's not a normal speed at sea level. We're talking about dense air compared to at altitude.
Actually, in the FDR data, the overspeed warning had come on quite I think about 30 seconds or so before the end of the data. Basically, that's basically a warning to the pilot that the plane has been flown too fast. But of course, in this case, whoever was in control of the plane obviously wasn't interested in the long-term survivability of the plane.
Maintenance record.
Yes.
Could someone repeat that for us?
I think you're just saying there was flutter, right? I mean,
Yeah. Well, I was just adding to that about there's a warning for the.
oh yeah, you're saying there was a warning light that comes on that indicates that he was flying too fast for the design of the plane.
The warning signal came on. This all happened in the last 40 seconds. We have that data. In fact, you saw the graph today. Didn't have the overspeed indicators. They're just on off. You saw the ramping up of the speed during the those last seconds. Total of 40 seconds, but around 36 seconds it started accelerating. And the overspeed warning came on rather quickly in that period, so let's say at around 30 seconds. And it's a warning to the pilots, hey, you're flying too fast, don't keep doing this, slow down. And it doesn't mean the plane's going to immediately fall apart. It means if you keep this up long enough, it may start falling apart. So the warnings happen, way before any actual destruction happens.
Okay, this next question is also for Warren, and going back to Barbara Honegger's other questions. I believe I saw on your slide of the radio altitude in the final approach that the FDR data has the plane hitting the wall at about 40 feet off the ground. Is this correct?
No, it's what I was plotting. The plots on my graphs are all above mean sea level. So it's the height above mean sea level. So I think the Pentagon was the ground level was about 36 feet. So it was basically just a few feet above the ground, not 40 feet above the ground.
So altitude versus height above the ground. And it was only about 4 feet above the ground.
Okay, also, I believe for Warren from Barbara, what is your response regarding the FDR's legitimacy that American Airlines' own press release put out just after the black boxes were allegedly recovered from the Pentagon rubble was that they were the wrong old, quote unquote, kind for any American Airlines 757, or therefore for Flight 77 on 9/11. So I'll repeat that if you need me to. And I believe it's for Warren, but I think anyone could pick that up if you know. Do you want me to repeat the question?
Yeah, I think
You think you got it?
yeah, I hadn't actually seen that comment before, but I'm a little bit confused as why American Airlines would claim that. Yep. Sorry, you got a comment there?
I'm going to comment here. Yeah, it's my understanding that, during the very initial reports that it was mentioned that it was a magnetic tape data system. I can't remember I've seen the press release. And American Airlines says, we don't have those kinds. We have modern solid state. And I think what you're telling from the description of what you've done is that the FDR data was a modern solid state, not magnetic tape device. And that's, I think, the clarification that Barbara's looking for.
Yes, it was a FA 2100 FDR. It's a solid state device. My understanding of the cockpit voice recorder might not have been.
That's correct. The cockpit voice recorder was from the wrong kind of plane. And therefore, because they're both in the same plane, how could the FDR have really been from Flight 77?
But they're different devices. One could be up to date and one not. So But the FDR definitely had solid state memory. It's there's 24 megabytes of data, and it's solid state, basically read directly out of the FDR. It's not like a waveform that's got to be translated like I've seen for some earlier. I'm aware of, like, for TWA Flight 800, for example, which was the older technology. The Flight 77 was definitely had a digital solid state flight data recorder, and the NTSB report also said it was solid state, and they said what the make and model was of the recorder, and also emphasised it was a solid state recorder.
Okay. So we're going to have 2 more questions, and then we're going to stop and we're going to go party. So, so the next question is from Tom Carlin. And are there eyewitnesses from the construction contractors working at the Pentagon? And that's just a general broad question. He's not saying eyewitnesses of what. So are there eyewitnesses from the construction contractors working at the Pentagon?
Yes.
Okay. And that could mean eyewitnesses of planes, the plane coming in?
Oh, there was, well,
or body,
was
seeing
it
what
Frank?
they saw?
I forget his name, but Probst, yes, Frank.
Yeah, Probst.
He was one of the, I believe, the director of some kind of reconstruction. There were the trailers outside that were just outside of the range of where the plane hit, and there was some discussion of Frank Probst's movements in and around. And he was in the building, and then he was in the trailer, and I believe he was actually out on the lawn, on the sidewalk, when the plane actually came in, and he was out of range of getting mowed down, but he was definitely right out there. And then Mickey Bell, he was one of, I'm not sure if he's an eyewitness if he was out and around, but he was definitely shaken up by the incident, and he got in his truck, and that was the truck that Wayne used to figure out the offset on the two videos.
Also, inside the construction trailer were people who reported the sounds of both the impacts and the plane going overhead. But technically, they were not witnesses because they were inside the building. They didn't know what happened or what was going on, but they reported. I mean, they described what it was like, and that's all I know right now. Again, if you want to listen to some really good, long. This is what I do when I'm on a treadmill at the Y, is I listen to Voices at 9/11, Pentagon, and there's just an enormous number of things you can listen to. Some of them were contractors, witnesses. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can listen to about people that were there at the time. No, it was some other. Library of Congress has got a whole slew of other things, but much of what's in the Library of Congress interviews are, I heard about it when I was taking my daughter to school when I was in Maryland or something. This is how I felt and react. There are some others. This is Chadwick Brooks, for example, did it. A couple other people have some really good descriptions of them being inside. I've got a list of the ones that I've listened to, I've identified and listened to, but it's Voices of 9/11, Voice of 9/11, and it's in Voices of 9/11, Pentagon. You should be able to get it, and you want to find Sergeant Christopher Brahman. He actually he's one of the ones that talks about meeting April Gallup in the hallway and taking them out with other people as they're fleeing out the door between Wedge 1 and Wedge 2. I thought they came out of the window, but that's what she says. But there's many other people that talk about her walking out. But these are the voices. These are the voices that provide richness to the stories, and they're consistent with the accounts that are in the book. Then Came the Fire, which you can download as a big PDF file. You can search that one. I mean, there's so many personal accounts, and they all describe different aspects of the same thing, and you just don't find any inconsistencies that are like so striking that you have to say, "Ooh, someone's given them a different line to tell, a different story to tell." Sergeant Christopher Brahman, Braman, I believe. He ultimately was in charge of a lot of the recovery. He's got an interesting story. I'll forward you the email to that.
Okay, last question. Robin, we're not going to be particularly, I saw you raising your hand.
I wanted to give you a chance to make a statement going back to Elizabeth Woodworth's fourth thing, but if you have another question, that's...
Yeah, let me go for the next question, and then you and Elizabeth can get together at the party.
No, I'd like to make it to you.
Oh, to me, okay.
No, to
Yes, all of us. Well, go ahead, make your statement.
This is the statement. I've run war games. I've been part of the military air defense system. I understand planning. And the statement that I thought was a little bit lacking from panel, except John kind of really drilled it pretty good. And here's my statement. If they planned part of it, they planned all of it. That's my statement. And that's something that I think that not just engineers, but a lot of people in the 9/11 Truth community get away from thinking about, because they get so close to the forest they can only see the trees. But if they planned part of this, they planned all of it. And that is the answer to Elizabeth Woodworth's question about why was the FBI there 4 minutes after the impact to get the tapes, because that's part of the plan.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Robin. Last question. Last question. We're going to, I think we can all agree that I don't think there's anyone who disagrees that if they planned part of it, they planned all of it. Last question. We're going to return back to the personal. And this is coming from Mark Peterson. And then after we hear from all our panelists, I'm going to do a closing statement. And then we're free to go to our house. Okay. When you decided to speak out regarding 9/11, was there fear, hesitation? Did your friends and your mates tell you not to do this? And then the next one is, would you agree that having people know you are interested in 9/11 truth is a liability in a professional sense? Okay, up to you guys. Go for it.
All right, so my first exposure to 9/11 truth, I'll call it, besides the videos I was given that went in one eye and out the other, was I was part of an Architects and Engineers go visit your member of Congress in 2011 in support of the 1,000th petition signature. I was terrified to actually, I could do the stuff on the internet, I didn't have any fear about being traced or anything like that, but to actually stand out in front of members of Congress, reading a statement, being photographed, video recorded, was terrifying. And yes, indeed, there were moments when I'm going through this process, being kind of egged on with one of my local 9/11 friends, but there were also concerns about professionalism, and ultimately that kind of got played out when I was front and center in a Hartford Current article about the anniversary and reading statements in front of the courthouse. So yes, indeed, there were these things. But what I've learned since is that there is no real stigma, really, professionally. I haven't run into any that has been really detrimental for speaking out. But of course, I don't talk about this stuff at the office. It just isn't something I can do. I think I answered as much of the question as I need to.
Well, when I came to understand the truth about 9/11, I'd been retired from a large corporation for about 5 or 6 years. So my job was not on the line with the corporation. But my wife and I owned an 8-unit apartment house, and my feeling was so strong that that I had to speak out. That one of the reasons we sold it right at that moment was so that I wouldn't upset tenants. I felt like if I had this apartment house and I started writing letters to the local papers, which I did, that I'd upset them, so we sold it, so that I could be, that was one of my reasons anyway. But as far as being frightened, I'm a very cautious person. I'll just tell you a brief story. I grew up on a great surfing beach in Sydney, Australia, and I always made sure I was never the furthest out, because if the sharks came, and they did come, and they rang the shark bell and you had to get out of the water, I figured that if I was not the furthest out, then the shark wouldn't get me. So I don't want to be the furthest out. I don't even want to be known, really. But my anger when I realized what they'd done was so great that I felt I couldn't live with myself unless I spoke out. And so it was like, it was fight or flight. Shall I speak out, stay in the country, or shall I flee back to Australia or New Zealand or anywhere to get away from this monstrous event which proves that the government is totally corrupt beyond measure? And but the funny thing was, I felt like if I didn't speak out, I couldn't live with myself. And that's why I spoke out. So the horror of the event and the realization of the truth overcame, and I got to the point where, so what? I'd rather speak out than stay alive and be silent.
Well, I started getting involved. I was teaching, this is toward the end of my career, but I was teaching at a charter school. Basically, it was a bunch of aging hippies running this thing. So, I mean, the administrator was fully supportive of what I was doing. I was coming out with, hey, look what I found. And I'd talk about it at school and no problem. And so I had never had that experience of feeling like my job was threatened by this. That's not the experience of others. Like Stephen Jones ultimately lost his job over this. He was professor at BYU. And there's other people who have, you know, Kevin Ryan lost his job. So there are people, depending on their circumstances, that either where it threatened what they were doing or it didn't. And in my case, I was very fortunate that I was with supportive people. My family was completely on board. Like, they know that I know what I'm talking about, and whether they understood everything or not, they recognized that I wasn't flaky, you know, and so that wasn't a problem. However, other people, other families, I know families that are split over it, and I could cite examples, but I won't. But anyway, there you go.
I think I was the earliest adopter of the people here because I started researching a week after the event, and it took me about 3 months of research before I was really fully convinced. I was very skeptical. I was like, this could really be the case. In fact, in my article, I tell why I was subject to the big lie thing, where, you know, if you tell a lie big enough, people won't believe it's true. And I thought, this is just so mammoth. How could they do this? Why would they couldn't get away with it? You know, those kind of thoughts, which turned out to all be wrong. But so I started researching about Thanksgiving of 2001. I was fully convinced, and it was like, okay, now what do I do? You know, I got to do something. I want to do something. It was kind of this is an outrage against all of humanity. And I thought, well, let's see. I'm an independent video producer, so I wasn't in danger of losing my job because I wasn't going to fire myself. And this movement that was just barely starting, there were very few people. They're going to need videos. And I make videos, so I guess I got a job. Doesn't pay well. But so that's what I've been doing for the last 17, 18 years. And but in terms of the fear, there was some for the first year, because for the first year the movement was pretty small, and so it was conceivable to see that maybe, you know, they'd try to pick people off in the movement in some way. You know, hear the footsteps of the FBI coming up the stairs and like, oh, here we go. I did have those fears, but I have my own philosophies of why those fears aren't valid, and they helped me through it. And by the time we hit about a year in, there were so many people in the movement, I didn't have any fears anymore.
But just one clarification, when you say they, you mean the entire government, or is it possible there's a segment of the government that the rest of the government is not even aware of?
There is what Bill Moyers in 87 did a segment on PBS called The Secret Government. And, you know, Bill Moyers is a pretty reputable guy, and this was on PBS, and this was after Iran-Contra, and he made the case quite effectively, and I've even used it in videos and distributed that particular one, that there is a secret government. It does operate independently and autonomously of the primary overt government. It's very small compared to the overt government. It involves a small, very small percentage of the government. The rest of the people are just employees doing their job. But they have immense power because they have immense money and they have immense secrecy. And it was real in 87. It was real long before that. It's still real. But it is a small minority, but they're a very powerful and effective one because they have so much money and they have so much secrecy to get away with what they do.
So, more.
Well, I just wanted to point out that Bill Moyers was a press secretary for Lyndon Johnson when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And if you want to find somebody who absolutely refuses to believe that Kennedy was assassinated by someone besides Lee Harvey Oswald, that's Bill Moyers.
Certain inconsistency there for sure.
So he can talk about the secret government from the inside, but he isn't going to tell you everything he knows. I also want to add one more point to this last thing, which is when I was questioned at the office by my higher-ups about my activities because of this centerpiece in our Hartford Current, I responded, do you know that we just put out a video, architects and engineers just put out a video with 43 high-rise architects and engineers, firefighters, fire protection engineers, all saying how these were not gravity-only collapses, and like that ended the conversation. Because I could now point to stuff. And so if you're going to be taking a stand and you want to be able to be credible, make sure that you're talking about stuff for which it is verifiable and not something like, no planes at the Twin Towers or no planes at the Pentagon. So things like, my opinion, so over.
All right, so we have had the most amazing conference, I feel, and the whole focus of this conference has been on evidence, both the eyewitness testimony and the hard physical evidence. We started with Ken Jenkins, who gave us a little history of the Pentagon controversy. He told us about his reasoning, along with Frank Legg, of why not just use a plane? And how did we get stuck? He answered that question and looked at how all of us have these characteristics that make us want to stick to certain beliefs that we have anchored to. And then he answered, okay, then what is the solution? How do we get unstuck? And awareness being the key to that, awareness of ourselves. And when we're aware of ourselves and our own tendencies, we can become better people and better truth seekers. David Chandler followed Ken and looked at the damage path coming into the Pentagon and the near alignment of all the points of contact. And he ended with his film of the plane actually crossing the lawn of the Pentagon, seeing the Pentagon plane. Wayne Costi followed that, describing the damage in detail, damage to the Pentagon wall, and how that was evidence of impact. The internal damage inside the Pentagon, and the C-ring hole. Then he also had an exploration of the distribution of the debris. Warren Stutt was our next speaker. He's a computer programmer, and he told us how he decoded the FDR recorder. And John Wyndham gave us an overview of all the evidence and compared how each of the hypotheses match both the eyewitness testimony and the hard physical evidence, and summed it up with that overview. And then lastly, we had this panel discussion and all of your excellent questions. So thank you.